Why do some men feel completely drained, controlled, or lost after giving their all to certain women? Is it love, or is it something far more ancient and darker than we dare admit? In this video, we uncover a hidden psychological truth: why some women don't just want your love, they want your soul. This isn't about blame, it's about liberation through awareness. Let's explore the unconscious traps men fall into and how to rise above them. In the depths of the unconscious, every man carries within him a feminine image, a primordial figure shaped not by the external women he's met, but by centuries of ancestral memory and personal psychological experience. This inner feminine is known as the Anima. She is not a woman, not a memory, not a fantasy, but a symbol. She lives in dreams, fantasies, projections, and emotional obsessions. When a man has not made this image conscious, she takes on a dangerous role. She begins to operate in the shadows, pulling the strings behind his choices, attachments, and desires, especially in his relationships with women. The Anima is not inherently malevolent. In her integrated form, she represents a man's capacity for empathy, creativity, vulnerability, and spiritual connection. But when she remains unexamined, undeveloped, she becomes distorted. She seduces, distracts, manipulates. She causes men to fall for women not as they are, but as they represent something he himself lacks. She is the whisper that tells him, "She will complete you," when in truth, she is merely echoing the void he refuses to face within himself. But just as every man holds an inner feminine, every woman carries her own psychological contents, her pain, desires, fears, and unmet needs. These are not always visible. They may remain hidden behind charm, beauty, or emotional openness. And when such a woman has not done her own inner work, when she has not faced the complexes or shadows of her psyche, she begins to unconsciously project them outward. And very often, the man becomes the canvas. He is no longer loved for who he is, but for how well he reflects her emotional labyrinth. If he is emotionally available, nurturing, or sensitive, he may be turned into a surrogate for her father or a symbolic redeemer of her past. If he is assertive and powerful, she may seek to conquer or tame him, not out of love, but from a compulsion to resolve her own lack of control. In either case, the relationship ceases to be between two conscious human beings. It becomes a stage for inner conflicts to act themselves out. The man, driven by his unintegrated anima, is often blind to this pattern. He doesn't see the woman before him, he sees what she awakens inside him. He feels drawn, sometimes obsessively, to the emotional intensity, the highs and lows, the mysterious aura she seems to carry. He believes he's in love. What he's really doing is dancing with his anima's shadow, pursuing a projection that flatters his inner narrative while concealing his psychological vulnerability. The woman, for her part, may not be aware of what she's doing either. She isn't necessarily malicious. In many cases, she is simply unconscious of her own trauma and emotional needs. She has learned, perhaps since childhood, that control is safety or that seduction brings affirmation. She may play the victim, the savior, or the muse. Without realizing these roles are part of a deeper pattern she's repeating, not out of choice, but from the momentum of unresolved pain. The result is a bond that feels intense but unstable. The man becomes emotionally entangled, trying to fix her, love her into healing, or prove his worth by enduring her chaos. He may feel drained but unable to walk away. He may sense something is wrong, yet remain captivated. This is the anima's shadow at work, the illusion of wholeness, the promise of transcendence through another, rather than through one's own inner journey. What complicates this further is the cultural narrative that romantic love is supposed to be passionate, irrational, all-consuming. Men are taught to chase, to conquer, to prove themselves through their loyalty and strength. But when these instincts are hijacked by the anima's projection, the man becomes a prisoner of his own unconscious. He no longer acts, he reacts. He no longer loves, he clings. Some women, particularly those who have been hurt, neglected, or emotionally manipulated themselves, learn to weaponize this dynamic. Again, often unconsciously, they sense the man's longing for meaning and use it to anchor him to their pain. They withhold affection to control him, alternate between vulnerability and aggression, or appeal to his protector instinct to make him emotionally dependent. These behaviors are not strategic, they're symptomatic. They point to an inner split between the conscious self and the buried complexes within. And so, the relationship becomes a mirror of wounds. She sees in him the father who left or never listened. He sees in her the goddess who will redeem his life's aimlessness. Neither sees the other clearly. Both are trapped in mythologies they didn't choose, but are compelled to live out. The Anima, instead of guiding the man toward inner wholeness, lures him into a spiritual maze. And the woman, instead of seeking authentic connection, uses him as a vessel to process what she cannot yet face alone. Within the unconscious realm of psychological archetypes, there exists an ancient and often misunderstood force, what can be called the devouring feminine. This is not a reference to women as individuals, but rather to an energetic form, a psychic blueprint that emerges when the feminine principle is cut off from awareness, integration, and self-responsibility. She appears in mythology as the siren who lures sailors into the abyss, the enchantress who offers ecstasy only to consume, and the mother who smothers her child in love until it loses the will to separate. She is not a villain by nature but becomes dangerous when her power operates unconsciously. This archetype resides in both men and women, but it is most often expressed through certain women who embody it without knowing, especially those who have never fully faced their inner wounds or developed their own sovereignty. She becomes the woman whose love has no boundaries, whose desire for intimacy masks a deep need for control. She offers herself completely, but what she takes in return is far more than affection. She takes energy, focus, and identity. To the unsuspecting man, she may first appear as deeply feminine, emotional, even spiritually awakened. She seems to understand him, to nourish his soul, to finally give him what he's longed for. But slowly, and often subtly, he begins to lose something. His clarity fades, his drive weakens, his inner compass spins. The devouring feminine doesn't attack directly, she absorbs. She consumes through the offer of unconditional love that later becomes conditional in hidden ways. She merges so completely with the man that his boundaries dissolve. His sense of independence, his ambition, his purpose. These begin to dim not because she asked him to surrender them, but because she offered him the illusion of completion. In merging with her, he believes he is becoming whole. In truth, he is being swallowed by an archetypal force that demands not partnership, but possession. At the core of this archetype is a hunger. It is the hunger of a feminine energy that has not been seen, validated, or protected. One that has had to survive through emotional influence rather than grounded selfhood. Her way of connecting is through fusion, not differentiation. She doesn't want a man to stand beside her. She wants a man to disappear into her. This desire is rarely conscious. It is the result of a fractured inner world that has learned love means clinging, that being close is the same as being one, and that separation is abandonment. This is why the devouring feminine archetype often shows up in the form of seduction, sexual, emotional, or spiritual. She pulls the man in with intensity, mystique, with emotional depth that promises transformation. She speaks in poetic terms, seems to see beneath the surface, and offers herself as a kind of sacred partner. But once he is entangled, the atmosphere shifts. His independence begins to feel like betrayal. His time alone becomes an act of rejection. His success, if not centered around her, threatens the bond. What initially felt like intimacy becomes a slow erosion of space and agency. For the man, this can be profoundly confusing. He may feel guilt when he tries to reclaim his solitude. He may begin to hide parts of himself just to keep the peace. He walks on eggshells, fearing her emotional storms or silent withdrawals. He tells himself this is what love requires: compromise, vulnerability, sacrifice. But beneath the surface, he is not growing, he is shrinking. He becomes the moon to her tides, endlessly shifting to avoid confrontation or loss. His vitality, once used to build, create, and lead, is now spent managing her emotional landscape. In some cases, the devouring feminine presents as nurturing, disguising control as care. She may constantly worry for him, make decisions on his behalf, or smother him with attention. On the outside, it appears loving, but underneath, it is a strategy for emotional domination. A way to keep him tethered by appealing to his need to feel needed. He begins to fear disappointing her more than he fears losing himself. And slowly, his identity conforms to what she demands. Without her ever needing to say it out loud, The psychological mechanism behind this dynamic is the unconscious fear of being abandoned or unseen. Rather than face that fear directly, the devouring feminine archetype seeks to bind others to herself. She draws energy not from reciprocity but from enmeshment. In doing so, she prevents both herself and the man from evolving. He is not loved for who he is becoming, but for how well he remains within her orbit. And she, unaware of her own inner fragmentation, mistakes control for connection and possession for loyalty. This archetype, like all unconscious forces, doesn't announce itself. It works in subtle patterns through shame, seduction, caretaking, silence, and emotional dependency. The man doesn't realize he's being consumed because it feels like he's being adored. But slowly, piece by piece, what is being devoured is not just his time or attention. It is his will, his individuality, and ultimately, his soul's direction. One of the most deceptive experiences in human relationships is the sensation of deep, immediate intimacy. It often arrives unannounced. Suddenly, if the soul has been seen, touched, understood without explanation, it feels fated, powerful, otherworldly. A man meets a woman who speaks to his pain, laughs at his humor, echoes his thoughts, and he believes, almost religiously, that he has found his other half. But beneath this euphoric connection often lies a psychological illusion, one manufactured not by the conscious will, by archetypal forces working below awareness. The man mistakes projection for truth. He assumes the emotional high is love, when it may in fact be the drama of his own ego, amplified and reflected through the lens of another. False intimacy begins when emotional resonance is mistaken for compatibility. A man may feel that the woman understands him like no one ever has. This perceived understanding is often a byproduct of the psychic blueprint he has carried within for years. She fits the image. She matches the pattern. She reflects his unmet desires, unspoken hopes, and secret wounds in such a precise way that he cannot help but feel connected. But this connection is not to her. It is to what she awakens in him. The woman becomes a mirror, but the reflection is distorted by longing. It shows him not what is, but what he wishes to see. In the early stages, this dynamic feels transcendent. The conversations are intense, the sexual energy electric, and the sense of urgency unbearable. It is not uncommon for such a man to describe the experience in spiritual terms. Soulmate, twin flame, divine feminine. He believes the universe brought her to him. In truth, he is experiencing ego inflation. His Anima, still unconscious and unintegrated, has found a host in the external world. And the woman, whether she realizes it or not, playing a role within that archetypal script. She may herself be projecting, seeing in him the savior, the father figure, or the muse for her own transformation. Two people, neither fully grounded in themselves, fall not into love, but into projection. And projection, by its very nature, is blinding. As the illusion deepens, so does the investment. The man feels elevated in her presence, as though she brings out the best in him. Or perhaps, the version of himself he always wanted to become. He begins to abandon logic, structure, and self-discipline in favor of emotional availability, spontaneity, and boundless presence. His internal compass shifts from self-direction to mutual absorption. He may pride himself on how deeply he feels, how much he is willing to give, how vulnerable he allows himself to be. And while vulnerability is a mark of strength in a conscious relationship, here it becomes a tool for ego validation. He confuses surrender with enlightenment, dependency with devotion. This is where the most dangerous part of false intimacy emerges. It flatters the ego while it shackles the soul. The man feels needed, admired, worshipped even. His identity begins to revolve around her recognition. Her praise becomes fuel, her disapproval becomes a wound. He cannot bear to disappoint her, not because of love, but because his self-image is now tied to her gaze. He no longer knows where she ends and he begins. The relationship becomes a stage upon which the ego performs its grand play, longing to be seen, affirmed, needed, adored. And as long as she continues playing her part, he remains captivated. But this dynamic is not stable. Archetypal projection is a fragile structure. Sooner or later, reality pierces through. The woman reveals her flaws, inconsistencies, or emotional volatility. Perhaps she withdraws suddenly, becomes possessive, or mirrors back his own unresolved insecurities. The man feels betrayed, not because she changed, but because the illusion begins to crack. He clings harder, doubling down on the intimacy, hoping to restore the high. But the emotional clarity he once felt begins to rot into confusion, anxiety, even obsession. At this point, he might experience inner conflict. Part of him knows something is wrong. He sees how much he's sacrificed, how far he's drifted from his core. But another part still craves her affirmation, her energy, her presence. This is the trap of false intimacy. It begins with the illusion of being seen and ends with the fear of being abandoned. The man, inflated by the ego and stripped of his boundaries, becomes emotionally dependent. He begins to negotiate his self-worth through the ever-shifting landscape of her reactions. And the more he tries to hold on to her, the more fragmented he becomes. There's also a subtle form of spiritual bypassing that arises in this pattern. The man may rationalize the chaos as part of a divine test or sacred union. He interprets her unpredictability as a sign of depth. He romanticizes her pain, believing that if he just loves her enough, she will heal. But what he does not realize is that this belief is not born out of compassion, but from the need to maintain his role as the savior. He is not truly seeing her. He is still protecting the projection that began it all. What he calls love is often a contract with his ego, one that refuses to admit that the connection was built on fantasy rather than truth. False intimacy is powerful precisely because it masquerades as awakening. It touches the deepest parts of the psyche, opening doors to emotional experiences that feel meaningful and rare. But these openings are not always paths to love. They are often invitations to confront the illusions one holds about love itself. When a man becomes infatuated with the idea of being understood, of being completed, or of being exalted through another, he steps into a psychological illusion that promises transcendence but delivers confusion, emotional volatility, and spiritual stagnation. Idealization is one of the most subtle and dangerous psychological mechanisms in human relationships. It feels beautiful at first, pure, elevating, even transcendent. A man meets a woman and places her above himself, not out of conscious inferiority, but because he mistakes admiration for truth. He sees her as perfect, flawless, perhaps divinely feminine, filled with qualities he feels he lacks or has lost touch with. She becomes not merely a partner but a symbol of salvation, of purpose, of meaning. And in that unconscious act of elevation, he begins to descend, not in her eyes but in his own. When a man idealizes a woman, he doesn't see her. He sees a projection of his hopes, his wounds, and his internal voids, shaped into a form he believes will rescue him from himself. This projection does not occur out of malice or delusion, but from a lack of inner integration. He places the burden of his spiritual evolution on her presence. She becomes the answer to questions he has not yet dared to ask. He may say he loves her, but what he loves is the image he has created. The goddess, the muse, the one who will finally make him whole. But wholeness cannot come from another. And the more he idealizes her, the more he fragments his own center. He begins to shift his values, compromise his boundaries, silence his instincts. Not because she demands it, but because the pedestal requires worship, not equality. He becomes addicted to her approval, terrified of her disappointment, and overly sensitive to her emotional shifts. His inner life becomes a mirror of her mood. Her presence becomes the sun around which his entire identity orbits. Slowly, his strength turns into submission, his clarity into confusion, his love into servitude. There is a profound psychological cost to idealization because it always contains the seed of resentment. When the woman inevitably fails to live up to the divine image he projected onto her, when she shows her wounds, her inconsistencies, her humanity, the man feels betrayed. But what truly betrayed him was not her behavior, it was the fantasy he created in worship. He expected her to be a symbol, not a person. He demanded that she fulfill a spiritual role she never agreed to play. And when she cannot hold that image, he may turn cold, distant, even angry. The devotion that once felt sacred begins to curdle into blame and disappointment. This is not an issue unique to romantic relationships. It is rooted in a man's unresolved relationship with the feminine aspect of his psyche. When the inner feminine, the anima, remains unconscious, it seeks expression through the outer world. It compels the man to search for a woman who embodies the lost parts of his own soul. She becomes the carrier of his creativity, sensitivity, intuition, or spiritual hunger. But by placing these qualities in her, he loses touch with them in himself. He cannot access them unless she is present, unless she reflects them back to him. He becomes dependent on her for emotional depth, for meaning, for identity. The woman, meanwhile, may at first enjoy the idealization. It flatters the ego to be placed on a pedestal. It feels like being chosen, adored, revered. But over time, this adoration turns into a trap. She cannot be herself. She must constantly perform the role he has cast her in. Wise but nurturing, mysterious but emotionally available, broken just enough to need him, but strong enough to lift him. She begins to suffocate under the weight of his projections. Any attempt to assert her individuality feels like a betrayal to him because it disturbs the dream he clings to. Some women learn to manipulate this dynamic, again, often unconsciously. They recognize that being idealized gives them power. They begin to curate their behavior to maintain the image, using emotional vulnerability as bait, spiritual language as a shield, or selective chaos as a way to keep the man emotionally invested. But this performance comes at a cost to both. She loses the freedom to be authentic, and he loses the capacity to discern truth from illusion. Their bond becomes a theater of archetypes, not a meeting of souls. The man who idealizes also fears loss more intensely than others. Because he has made her the anchor of his meaning, her absence would not simply be the end of a relationship. It would be the collapse of an entire belief system. That's why idealization often leads to obsession. He becomes consumed with keeping her close, proving his worth, or decoding her every word. He watches for signs, seeks reassurance, lives in a heightened state of emotional vigilance. But all of this is rooted in fear. The fear that without her, he is incomplete, directionless, and empty. This dependency masks itself as love, but it is something darker. It is spiritual possession masquerading as romantic loyalty. The man does not grow in her presence. He is arrested in his development. He becomes what she needs or expects, not who he truly is. And she, in turn, remains locked in a dynamic where her value is measured by how well she performs the divine script. Neither finds true intimacy, because true intimacy requires equality, not worship. It demands presence, not projection. It begins where idealization ends. When a man has built his identity on the illusion of her perfection, to release that illusion would mean facing the parts of himself he spent a lifetime avoiding. What often appears as love, attraction, or soul connection is, in many cases, the unconscious seeking completion through another. When a man lacks integration within, he will find himself drawn to forces outside of himself, forces that mirror not reality, but the forgotten and fragmented aspects of his own psyche. Some women, knowingly or not, embody archetypal energies that do not nourish but consume. These dynamics, whether through seduction, idealization, false intimacy, or emotional fusion, do not arise randomly. They are the result of inner patterns left unexplored, wounds left unhealed, and projections left unclaimed. To truly know a woman, a man must first know himself, not in the superficial sense of preferences or habits, but in the deeper, more painful understanding of his emotional inheritance, his inner feminine, his fears, and his longings. Without this awareness, he becomes vulnerable, not to her, but to what she represents within him. He is not captured by her, but by his own unexamined mythology. The path forward is not to reject women, nor to armor oneself with suspicion. It is to become so deeply rooted in the self that no image, no illusion, no enchantment can pull him off center. It is to recognize the difference between a woman and a symbol, between connection and control, between devotion and dependency. Only then can he enter into relationship, not as a seeker of completion, but as one who already walks whole and invites the other to do the same. The truth is not dark to those who can bear to see it. The truth only wounds those who have built their lives around illusion. When a man dares to confront the hidden forces behind his desires, he awakens not just to the reality of others, but to the depth of his own soul. And from that awakening, love, real, grounded, and liberating, can finally begin.